The call came at 2:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been awake anyway, sitting in my recliner with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching some old Western I'd already seen 3 times. When the phone buzzed on the side table, I already knew. You get to a certain age and a middle-of-the-night call stops being a surprise. It becomes something you've been quietly dreading for years. My name is Howard Greer. I'm 67 years old, retired engineer, widower. Dale was my only child. The voice on the phone told me she'd collapsed at her desk, brain aneurysm. By the time they got her to Mercy General, she was already gone. She was 38 years old. I drove to the hospital in my work boots and a flannel shirt I'd been sleeping in. I didn't think about changing. I just grabbed my keys and went. I got there around 3 in the morning, sat in a plastic chair in a hallway, and answered questions from a nurse I couldn't really focus on. Signed whatever they put in front of me. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same kind you see in every hospital, and I just sat there in that hum for a long time, not moving. Brent didn't show up until almost noon. Brent Calloway, my son-in-law, Dale's husband of 9 years. He walked in wearing pressed slacks and a jacket, hair combed, like he'd taken his time getting ready. He said there'd been traffic. He said he'd had to find someone to watch Marvin. I'd already called Marvin's school myself, first thing that morning, told them what happened, arranged for him to spend the day with his best friend's family. Marvin was 8 years old and he'd just lost his mother. I wasn't going to let him sit at school wondering why nobody picked him up. Brent didn't know I'd done that. He didn't ask about it either. "She's gone," I said. When he walked over to me, he nodded. Stood there for a second with his hands in his pockets. "I can't believe it," he said. "She seemed fine yesterday." Something in his face wasn't right. I'd spent 40 years reading job sites, reading blueprints, reading people who were trying to cut corners. I know what a man looks like when he's performing. Brent stood in that hallway and performed grief the same way a bad contractor performs confidence. The words were right, but nothing underneath them was solid. He excused himself twice to make phone calls. Both times he stepped around the corner and kept his voice low. When the hospital staff came with questions about arrangements, he deferred to me every time. "You knew her better than anyone," he said. That part was true, but it still shouldn't have been that easy for him to say. The funeral was 4 days later. I've been to enough funerals to know what real grief looks like in a room. It moves through people differently. Some go quiet, some can't stop talking. Some just stand there like they forgot how to use their arms. But there's always something underneath it that's real. Brent wore a dark suit, pressed and fitted, and worked the room like he was at a professional event. He shook hands, he accepted condolences with a slight nod and a practiced exhale. He placed his hand briefly on the shoulder of Dale's former colleague from her law firm and said something that made the man nod slowly. I watched all of it from the front pew with Marvin pressed against my side. Marvin cried the way kids cry when they don't know anyone's watching. His shoulders shook. He kept wiping his face with the sleeve of his dress shirt, and at one point he leaned up and whispered to me, "Is she really in there, Grandpa?" He meant the casket. "Her body is," I told him, "but everything that made her your mom that's still with you." He thought about that for a second, then nodded. "I can still feel her sometimes," he said. I held on to him and didn't say anything else. A woman came up to me during the reception, someone Dale had represented in a custody case 3 years back. She held both my hands and told me that Dale had reduced her fees when she found out the woman was struggling to make rent. She said Dale was the only attorney she'd ever met who seemed to actually care about the outcome, not just the invoice. I stored that one carefully. Marvin would want to hear it someday. I was watching Brent when the woman spoke to me. He was across the room near the door, deep in conversation with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, expensive shoes. When I moved in their direction, they separated cleanly. Brent introduced him as a business contact, something about commercial real estate. The man offered condolences in the flat tone of someone who'd never met Dale and wasn't particularly sorry she was gone. I shook his hand and filed his face away. That evening, Roland Fierro found me in the hallway near the coat room. Roland had been Dale's closest friend since law school, and his grief was the real kind. Red eyes, tight jaw, the kind of quiet that settles on a man who doesn't know what to do with his hands. He pulled me aside and kept his voice low. "There are matters in Dale's will that need attention soon," he said. "I can't get into it here, but she asked me to tell you one thing right now." He paused. "Trust your instincts about Marvin?" I glanced across the room. Marvin was sitting alone in a folding chair, still in his dress clothes, staring at a point on the floor while Brent stood 10 feet away checking his phone. "I understand," I said. Roland nodded. "My office, day after tomorrow. The will reading was 2 days after the funeral." Brent came in looking confident. He sat across from Roland with his hands folded on the desk like a man who expects good news. He'd brought his own attorney, a younger guy who kept a legal pad in front of him and didn't say much. Roland read the provisions without drama. The lake property went to Brent. An investment account with Hargrove Capital went to Brent. A life insurance policy of $500,000 went to Brent. Then Roland kept going. The house at 412 Birchwood Lane, Dale and Brent's home, the one with Marvin's treehouse in the backyard, that went to me. Both vehicles. The personal checking account at First National. All of it to Howard Greer. Brent's expression shifted. The confidence drained out like water through cracked concrete. "That's not possible," he said. "We bought that house together. That's marital property." Roland slid a document across the desk. The house was purchased in Dale's name alone before the marriage. It was never converted to joint ownership. "The deed confirms this. What about Marvin's college fund?" Brent asked. His voice had an edge now. "A trust has been established for Marvin's education and care," Roland said. "Howard is named trustee." That one hit Brent harder than the house. I could see his jaw tighten. "When was this changed?" he asked. 4 months ago. "Dale came to me specifically to make these arrangements," Brent said. She never mentioned it. I believed him because I was starting to understand exactly why she hadn't. After the meeting, Roland asked me to stay back. He handed me a sealed envelope. Dale's handwriting on the front. "Just, Dad, read it at home," he said. "When you're alone." In the lobby on the way out, I passed Brent on his phone. He had his back to me and didn't hear me coming. I slowed down without stopping. "Completely blindsided me," he was saying low and tight. "The house, the accounts, even the kids' education fund. Yes, I'm going to fight it. I've put 9 years in. I deserve more than a lake property and an insurance check." He said a name, Sheila. Then something about a fresh start in accounts that were already set up. I kept walking and took the stairs. At home that evening, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. Marvin was staying with Norma next door, the retired teacher who'd been helping me with pickups all week. I had the house to myself. Dale's handwriting was neat, the same as it had been since she was a girl. "Dad, if you're reading this, something went wrong. I'm sorry to do this to you, but there's no one else I trust. Brent and I have been falling apart for over a year. I found out 4 months ago that he's been seeing a woman named Sheila who works in his building. When I confronted him, he denied it, but I've seen the messages. I know what's been going on. I haven't filed for divorce yet because I'm afraid of what happens to Marvin if things go sideways fast. Brent isn't violent, but he's calculating, he plays to win, and he plans ahead. I needed to move the assets first before he could. The house, the cars, the accounts, those aren't really for you, they're tools. They exist so Marvin always has one adult in his corner who can't be pushed out or bought off. Brent will come after the assets. He'll be polite about it at first. Don't let him know what you know. Watch him. Document everything you see, especially anything involving Marvin. Roland has the rest of my instructions and will know when to move. I love you, Dad. You spent 40 years building things that last. You always checked the work twice. You never signed off on something until you were sure it would hold. I need that same thing from you now for Marvin Dale." I sat at that table for a long time after I finished reading. Then I got up, washed my coffee cup, and called Roland. "Tell me what evidence she gathered," I said. "And tell me what else I need to do." Roland had more for me than I expected. Dale had been thorough. She documented text messages between Brent and Sheila going back 8 months. Exchanges she'd screenshotted from his phone during a night he'd left it on the kitchen counter. The messages laid out an affair that had been running for nearly a year. There were complaints about the marriage, about feeling trapped, references to Marvin as a complication. In one exchange from 6 weeks before Dale died, Sheila had pushed Brent on timing. His response, patience, a few more months, everything will fall into place. Roland also had a report from an investigator Dale had hired, photographs of Brent and Sheila at a hotel, expense records, background on Sheila's finances and her connection to a small real estate development LLC that Brent had quietly co-founded 7 months earlier. Dale had been building a case. She just hadn't had enough time to use it. She was going to file in the spring, Roland said. She was waiting until she had everything in order. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "What do I do now?" "You keep a log," Roland said. "The same way you used to document a job site, date, time, what you observed, who was present. Every incident involving Marvin. Every time Brent says one thing and does another. Every broken promise, every absence, we build the pattern. And Brent, let him think he's making progress. Don't agree to anything, don't sign anything, but don't shut the door either. Keep him talking." It wasn't complicated advice. It was the same principle I'd applied to bad contractors for 4 decades. You don't confront a man who's cutting corners. You watch him, you document it, and when the time comes, you let the record speak. I went to the hardware store the next morning and picked up 2 additional security cameras. I knew exactly where to mount them. Brent came by the house 10 days after the will reading. He was polite about it. That was his style. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd made him and talked around the subject for a few minutes before getting to the point. He said the Will situation was obviously some kind of misunderstanding. He said Dale hadn't been herself in those final months, that the stress of her caseload had been affecting her judgment. He said he didn't want things to get ugly between us for Marvin's sake. Then he slid a piece of paper across the table. If I signed the house back over to him, he'd guarantee I could see Marvin regularly. Weekends, holidays, whatever I needed, he'd put it in writing. Clean and simple, he said. No lawyers, no courts, no drama. I looked at the paper, took my time with it. I appreciate you bringing this to me directly, I said. I need a few days to think it over. This is all still pretty raw. He nodded like he understood completely, said to take all the time I needed. Left 20 minutes later, looking satisfied. I called Roland from the driveway while Brent's car was still visible at the end of the street. He put it in writing, I said. Good. Roland said, keep it. Don't sign anything, and start the log tonight. I opened a new notebook that evening, the same kind I used on job sites, a plain composition book with a hard cover. I wrote the date at the top of the first page and started with that afternoon's visit. What time Brent arrived, what he said as close to word for word as I could get it, what he left behind. Over the following 3 weeks, that notebook filled up faster than I expected. The cameras I'd mounted covered the front entry, the kitchen, and the living room. I'd wired them myself in an afternoon, same basic setup I'd used on job trailers for years. They recorded to a hard drive in my bedroom closet and sent alerts to my phone. Brent didn't know they were there. The first incident worth noting came 12 days in. Brent had Marvin for the weekend. He brought him back Sunday evening, 2 hours later than agreed, and Marvin walked in the door looking like he'd had the energy drained out of him. He went straight to the couch and didn't say much. Later, after Brent had left, Marvin told me they'd spent most of Saturday at Brent's office because he had calls to handle. Marvin had sat in a conference room for 4 hours watching videos on an iPad. I wrote it down, date, time, what Marvin said, his demeanor when he came home. The second incident came the following week. Marvin had a soccer game on a Thursday afternoon. Brent had said he'd be there. I went too, sat in my folding chair on the sideline the way I always did. Brent texted Marvin at 4:15, 10 minutes before kickoff, saying he was caught in a meeting and couldn't make it. Marvin read the text on the sideline and handed the phone back to me without saying anything. He played the whole game, scored once, looked for his father in the crowd every time something good happened. I wrote that down too. The third incident was the one that made me call Roland the same night it happened. Marvin had an asthma inhaler, a maintenance inhaler he was supposed to use every morning. I'd been handling his overnight bag since the funeral, and I knew exactly how much was left in it. When Brent picked him up for a 5-day stretch in mid-October, there were 9 days of doses remaining. When Marvin came back, the inhaler was empty and Brent hadn't refilled it. 2 days later, Marvin had an attack at soccer practice. Mild, but real. I drove him to the pharmacy and got the prescription filled while he sat in the passenger seat looking pale and trying to slow his breathing down. Did you tell your dad the inhaler was running low? I asked him on the way home. Yeah, he said. He said he'd handle it. I wrote 4 pages in the notebook that night. Roland told me to get a copy of the prescription record from the pharmacy. I did. It showed the previous fill date and confirmed the gap. He added it to the file he was building. Around week 4, Brent brought up a boat trip. He was taking Marvin down to spend a long weekend with a friend who had a place on the water. He mentioned it casually, like he was doing Marvin a favor. What he didn't mention was that Sheila would be there. Marvin told me that part himself when he got back in the same matter-of-fact way. Kids report things they've decided aren't worth making a fuss about. She was there the whole time, Marvin said. Dad said she's just someone from work. He paused. She kept telling me to be careful on the boat, like every 5 minutes. It was kind of annoying. I asked him if he had fun. He shrugged. Dad and her talked a lot. I mostly watched movies in the cabin. He'd been on a boat for 3 days and spent most of it alone in a cabin watching movies. He was 8 years old and 2 months out from losing his mother. I didn't say anything negative about Brent. I never did, not directly, not in front of Marvin, but I wrote down everything he told me word for word that same evening. The notebook was getting thick. Roland called me a few days later with an update. The investigator had confirmed that Sheila had been present on the boat trip. There were also new developments on Brent's financial activity. He'd moved a significant amount from a joint account he and Dale had maintained into a personal account, something he'd done quietly in the 6 weeks before she died. Roland said the timing was worth noting. How much longer do we wait? I asked. Not much longer, Roland said. We need one more thing from Brent. Let him make his next move. He'll give us what we need. I closed the notebook and put it back on the workbench. Then I went to check on Marvin. Brent called me on a Tuesday and invited me to dinner. He picked a place downtown, the kind of restaurant with small portions and a wine list that takes up half the menu. He was already seated when I arrived, jacket on, phone face down on the table. He ordered a bottle of something expensive without asking what I wanted and made a toast to moving forward. I sipped the wine and let him talk. He said he'd been thinking hard about the situation, said he understood the will was legally valid, that he wasn't trying to dispute that. What he wanted, he said, was a practical solution, something that worked for everyone, especially Marvin. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. If I transferred the house and both vehicles back to him, he would guarantee my visitation rights in writing, weekends, holidays, school breaks. He'd have his attorney formalize it. He called it a fair exchange, a way to avoid years of legal proceedings that would only hurt Marvin in the end. I picked up the document and read through it slowly. He watched me read it. I could tell he'd rehearsed this, the tone, the framing, the part about Marvin. It was a clean performance. "This is quite thorough," I said. "I want to make sure we both feel protected," he said. I asked a few questions about the visitation schedule, asked what would happen if he relocated for work. He had smooth answers ready for all of it. When I mentioned having Roland look it over, his expression tightened just slightly before he reset it. "I'd rather we handle this between ourselves," he said. "Roland has loyalties to the old arrangement. I think we can find something better, just the two of us." I nodded like I was considering it. Told him I needed a few more days. He paid the check and walked me to my truck and shook my hand in the parking lot like we'd just closed a deal. I drove straight to Roland's house and knocked on his door at 9 in the evening. He read the document at his kitchen table while I stood by the window. "This is coercion," he said. "After about 3 minutes, he is explicitly offering you access to your own grandson in exchange for assets that are legally yours." He put it in writing and signed it. He set the paper down. "This is the last piece we needed." Roland filed the emergency custody modification petition 2 days later. The same morning, Brent had scheduled a call with me, expecting I was close to signing. Instead, a process server showed up at his office. He called me that afternoon. I let him go for a while without responding. When he finally slowed down, I told him that Roland would be handling all communication going forward. Then I ended the call. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following week in front of Judge Patrice Holt. I wore the same dark blazer I'd worn to Dale's funeral. Roland told me to be straightforward and to keep my answers short. He said Judge Holt didn't have patience for speeches. Brent came in with a sharp attorney named Gerald Pruitt, expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who talks fast and makes everything sound reasonable. Brent had dressed down slightly, sport coat instead of his usual tailored jacket. The adjustment was deliberate. He was trying to look like a regular dad. Roland presented our case in the order we'd assembled it. The log, the camera footage, the pharmacy records showing the gap in Marvin's inhaler prescription, statements from Marvin's teacher about missed conferences and incomplete homework during Brent's custody stretches, notes from Marvin's grief counselor documenting increased anxiety and sleep disruption that tracked directly with his time in Brent's care. The boat trip, with Sheila present, confirmed by the investigator's report. And the dinner document, signed by Brent, offering to trade a grandfather's access to his grandson for real estate. Pruitt countered with confidence. He called my log obsessive. He said the missed conference was a scheduling error. He said the inhaler situation was an isolated oversight during an extraordinarily difficult period of grief. He painted Brent as a father doing his best under impossible circumstances and me as an interfering in-law who had manipulated a grieving man's trust. Then Judge Holt started asking questions. She looked at Brent directly. "Mr. Calloway, your stepson's asthma prescription lapsed for 11 days while in your care. Can you walk me through what happened?" Brent said he'd been overwhelmed, that there were a lot of moving pieces after Dale's death. The prescription was the same one he'd been on for 2 years. Judge Holt said it wasn't a new medication. What specifically prevented the refill? Brent said he hadn't realized the supply was running low. His grandfather realized it, she said. She looked down at the file. "Your son told his school counselor in early October that he was scared. His father was going to move him somewhere far away. Did you have conversations with him about relocating?" Brent said he may have mentioned it casually, that it wasn't a serious discussion. "He's 8 years old, Judge Holt said. He lost his mother 6 weeks ago. A casual mention of relocation lands differently at that age." She made a note. "We'll continue." Pruitt tried to redirect twice. She let him finish both times and then went back to her own questions. When she'd heard enough, she said she was going to review the documentation in chambers and return within the hour. We waited in the hallway. Brent and Pruitt stayed at the far end. Roland and I sat near the window. Neither of us said much. When we went back in, Judge Holt didn't take long. "Having reviewed all submitted evidence and testimony, I find sufficient cause for emergency intervention," she said. Temporary guardianship of Marvin Calloway is hereby granted to Howard Greer for a period of 60 days, during which a full family evaluation will be conducted by court-appointed specialists. The respondent will have supervised visitation 3 times weekly. Neither party may remove the child from the jurisdiction. Across the room, Brent said something to Pruitt in a sharp whisper. Judge Holt looked over at him. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I'd strongly encourage you to use the next 60 days demonstrating the parenting your son needs rather than disputing this ruling." Court adjourned. The gavel came down. I sat still for a moment after it did. Roland put his hand on my shoulder briefly. I nodded and reached for my jacket. Outside the courthouse, the air was cold and the sky was flat gray. I stood on the steps for a minute before walking to my truck. Marvin was at Norma's house doing homework at her kitchen table, completely unaware of what had just happened in that room. I needed to get to him before Brent did. I drove without the radio on. Brent lasted 3 weeks into the evaluation period. His attorney contacted Roland on a Thursday morning. Brent was withdrawing his custody claim. He and Sheila were relocating to the Cayman Islands, where a resort development deal had come through. He would sign over full legal guardianship to me, in exchange for no further investigation into the financial transfers he'd made in the months before Dale died. Roland called me with the news while I was in the backyard pulling up the last of the season's tomato steaks. "He's choosing her over his son," I said. "Yes," Roland said. I stood there for a second, with a steak in my hand and dirt on my gloves. "Get it in writing," I said. The final order was signed by Judge Holt on a Tuesday morning. Marvin Calloway, age 8, under the full legal guardianship of Howard Greer. Brent's support payments would be handled through Roland's office going forward. There was no ceremony to it. Just signatures and a court stamp and Roland shaking my hand in the hallway outside the clerk's office. I picked Marvin up from school that afternoon. He climbed into the truck and dropped his backpack on the floor and started telling me about a science project he wanted to do on how suspension bridges distribute weight. I told him I might know something about that. He talked the whole way home. We stopped for burgers. He ate most of his and half of mine. That evening, after he was in bed, I found the last envelope Roland had been holding for me. Dale's handwriting on the front. "When it's done." I sat at the kitchen table and opened it. "Dad, if you're reading this, you finished what I couldn't. I don't have the words for what that means. I know this wasn't the retirement you planned. I know it wasn't fair to hand you this. But I've known you my whole life, and I never once saw you walk away from something that needed to be done right. You checked every beam. You signed off on every inspection. You never let anything go out the door that wasn't solid. That's what Marvin needed. Someone who doesn't cut corners. Someone who shows up. Tell him stories about me. Not just the good ones. Tell him I made mistakes. Tell him I waited too long. But tell him that when it mattered, I did what I could to make sure he'd be okay. I think he'll understand that better when he's older. Take care of yourself too. You've earned more than just being someone's safety net. I love you. I always have. Dale." I folded the letter once and set it on the table. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there with my hands flat on the wood and looked at her handwriting for a while. Then I got up and checked on Marvin. He was asleep the way kids sleep when they feel safe. One arm hanging off the side of the mattress. A library book open on the pillow next to him. I set the book on the nightstand and pulled the blanket up to his shoulder. I stood in the doorway for a moment. "I got him, Dale," I said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. Then I went back to the kitchen, poured myself a proper cup of coffee, and sat down in the quiet house. The notebook was still on the workbench. The cameras were still running. The legal files were in a drawer in the study. All of it had done its job. None of it mattered anymore in the way it had for the past 3 months. What mattered now was the kid asleep upstairs and the years ahead of us. I thought about what Dale had written. You never let anything go out the door that wasn't solid. She was right about that. 40 years of checking the work, reading the specs, making sure the thing you built would still be standing after the first hard winter. Most of the time, nobody notices when a building holds. They only call you when something falls down, but the holding is the whole job. It always was. Marvin and I had a long road in front of us. There would be hard conversations, questions I wouldn't always have good answers for, days when he'd miss his mother so much it would knock the air out of both of us. I wasn't naive about any of that, but the foundation was solid. That much I knew how to do. If you're watching this and you've been through something like what I went through, I want you to hear this. The people who try to take advantage of you after a loss, they count on you being too tired and too broken to push back. They count on grief making you slow. Don't let them have that. You document everything, you get the right people in your corner, you keep your mouth shut until the time is right. And when the time comes, you let the record speak. That's not revenge. That's just building something that holds. My daughter trusted me to protect her son, and I wasn't going to let her down. Neither should you.